Genesis chapter 8. A new beginning. The storm was over. The rain had stopped. The violent waters that had swallowed the earth were no longer rising. But Noah, his family, and every living creature inside the ark were still surrounded by an endless sea. For months, they had lived inside the massive vessel. No open fields, no familiar horizon, no solid ground beneath their feet. Only the ark, only the animals, only the sound of water and the promise of God. Then, in the midst of the silence, something changed. The Bible tells us that God remembered Noah, not because Noah had ever been forgotten. The Creator had never lost sight of the ark drifting across the waters. But now, the time had come for God to act. The same God who had commanded Noah to build the ark would now guide him into a new world. A powerful wind swept across the earth. The waters began to move. Slowly, the flood that had covered the land began to retreat. The great fountains beneath the earth were restrained. The heavens closed. The rain stopped. Day after day, the water level fell. At first, Noah may have noticed only the slightest change. But after months of drifting, the ark finally came to rest. The enormous vessel settled upon the mountains of Ararat. For the first time in what must have seemed like an eternity, the ark stopped moving. Still, Noah could not simply open the door and walk outside. The waters remained. The mountains were only the beginning. Patience was still required. Days passed, then weeks. Slowly, the tops of other mountains began to emerge from the water. The world was returning. But Noah needed to know when it was safe. So he opened a window in the ark. Then he released a raven. The bird flew back and forth over the waters, searching for a place to rest. But Noah needed more evidence. Later, he sent out a dove. The dove flew into the open sky. For the first time in months, perhaps Noah watched as something from the ark disappeared into the distance. But the dove found nowhere to land. The earth was still covered by water, so it returned. Noah reached out his hand and brought the bird safely back inside. Then he waited. 7 more days. Again, Noah sent out the dove. This time, when it returned, something extraordinary was held in its beak. A freshly plucked olive leaf, a small branch, a simple sign. But to Noah, it meant everything. Life was returning. The waters were retreating. The earth was beginning to breathe again. Imagine the hope that must have filled the ark. After months surrounded by destruction, there was now evidence of renewal. A green leaf, a sign that the world was not dead. God was making a way forward. Noah waited another 7 days. Then he released the dove once more. This time, it did not return. The bird had found a home. Dry land was near. Still, Noah did not rush ahead. He waited for God's command. Eventually, he removed part of the covering of the ark and looked out. For the first time, he saw the earth, not beneath an endless flood, but drying, recovering, ready for life to begin again. Then, at last, God spoke. "Come out of the ark." After more than a year inside the vessel, Noah and his family stepped onto solid ground. Imagine that first step. The feeling of earth beneath their feet, the fresh air, the open sky, the silence of a world completely changed. Behind them stood the ark, the vessel that had carried them through the greatest storm humanity had ever known. Before them stretched an uncertain future, no cities, no familiar communities, no neighbors waiting to welcome them home. Everything they had known was gone. But they were alive. And more importantly, they were not alone. God had brought them through. The animals were released, birds took to the skies, creatures scattered across the land. Life began again. And Noah's first response was not to build a house, not to plant a field, not to claim land. His first response was worship. Noah built an altar to the Lord. From the animals that had been set apart for sacrifice, he offered a sacrifice of thanksgiving. It was an act of worship after judgment. an acknowledgement that everything Noah possessed, every breath, every member of his family, every living creature that had survived, was a gift from God. The world had changed, but God's mercy remained. God received Noah's offering. Then he made a promise. Never again would he destroy all living creatures through a flood in the same way. The cycle of the earth would continue. Seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night. As long as the earth remained, these rhythms would continue. It was a promise of stability after chaos, a promise that life would move forward. The storm had ended, but the human heart had not suddenly become perfect. Noah and his family still carried the same broken nature that had existed before the flood. The waters could wash across the earth, but only God could ultimately transform the heart. The flood had not ended humanity's need for redemption. That need remained, but so did hope. Noah stood at the beginning of a new world. Behind him was judgment. Before him was a future filled with uncertainty. And above him was the same God who had created the heavens and the earth. The God who had warned him. The God who had instructed him. The God who had protected him. And the God who had remembered him. Sometimes, faith requires building before the rain begins. Sometimes, it requires trusting when the storm is at its worst. And sometimes, faith requires waiting. Waiting for the waters to fall. Waiting for the door to open. Waiting for God to say, now. For Noah, that moment had finally come. He had survived the flood, but the story was far from over. A new covenant was about to be established. A promise would be given, not only to Noah, but to every generation that followed. And God would place a sign in the sky, a reminder that even after the darkest storm, His mercy endures. To be continued in Genesis chapter 9.